unassuming grandmother, or the death house landlady. Today we talk about the murders at the boarding house. Our story begins in 1988 at a charming Sacramento, California boarding house on 1426 F Street, a place for fostering the homeless, elderly, and afflicted. A day like any other, warm, sunny. The only complaint was to come from a local social worker named Judy Mose asking for a wellness check. Alberto Montoya, a known disabled man, had not stayed in contact with this caring social worker, which was out of character. The owner of this boarding house had stated that Alberto randomly moved away with family months prior. The owner's name? Dorothea Puente. When police arrived on Dorothea's doorstep, they felt a sense of calm. Her sweet demeanor gave the officers a peace of mind. Seeing that she physically resembled an early 60-year-old grandmother, they treated her as such. As someone who would help them sort out a misunderstanding brought on by an overpassionate social worker. They walked through the house and they found nothing. Nothing besides the few quirks her and some residents were bound to have, which brings us to the final tip-off our social worker Judy had given the police. Telling the officers to bring a shovel or two, not to help garden, but because there always seemed to be large mounds of dirt all over Dorothea's property, which gave the police something to go off of. The police obliged Judy's request, and so does Dorothea. They begin to dig aimlessly around Dorothea's yard, expecting to find dirt, and roots, and the occasional rock. Instead, they uncovered human remains. Dorothea seemed to be distraught, and in the commotion, a detective gave Dorothea permission to go have a coffee away from it all. As the hours progressed, police uncovered multiple bodies from the unsuspecting backyard of 1426 F Street. When police were finally done excavating and finally ready to start formulating suspects, their first bill of business was with Dorothea Puente. Hours earlier, escorted to a coffee shop with no surveillance, Dorothea was now nowhere to be found. At the expense and the shame of the police, Dorothea was not found for another 5 days. As the bodies piled up, so did the stress of the police, and even more so, Dorothea's claimed innocence. To make this long story short, since much of these suspected murders were convicted through circumstance, it was extremely hard to find definitive evidence that directly incriminated Dorothea. Although some of the murders remained technically unsolved, 3 of these alleged murders were used to keep Dorothea in prison for the rest of her natural life. If you're wanting to see a brand new detailed documentary about these murders that came out last week, April 18th, 2021, I'll leave a link to the 2-part series made by Oxygen called The Murders at the Boarding House in the description below. Now, in order to properly psychoanalyze Miss Puente, we're going to need to make some moderate assumptions. Although she claims complete innocence, we will trust the judgment of her jury and the judge, as well as the forensic psychiatrist that interviewed her after her trial named William Vicari. Dr. Vicari figured out very quickly that she didn't have any major mental illnesses, at least on the surface. Others would go on to claim that she had a very severe case of antisocial personality disorder. These accusations call to question her past, intense moments that harbored extreme physical and mental abuse. In some reports, there is even talk of severe sexual abuse. Dr. Vicari goes on to find that she does indeed harbor this inherent social rage and resentment towards individuals who remind her of her abusive past. In order to make our second assumption, we find further evidence of Dorothea not showing a large amount of remorse for the victims found dead in her backyard. Regardless of who may have killed them, her lack of reaction towards the deaths of her tenants she claimed to love was a very significant piece of evidence towards the end of her trial. The assumption being that she did indeed have a type of antisocial personality disorder that perpetuated these serial killer tendencies, and an overall lack of remorse. According to the Radford University Annual Report on Serial Killers 2018 edition, only 6.1% of serial killers in the 1980s were women, but of those 6%, 53% of them used poison as a method of killing their victims, just like Dorothea. She seemed to use a concoction of codeine, acetaminophen, and a pain reducer used for mouth pain called Dalmane in order to sedate and control her victims through overdosing. To cross-reference further, her reasons for killing were also very similar to that of why the majority of other women would murder people too. According to the same Radford report, 71.1% of women serial killers in the 1980s were found to kill for financial gain. Again, just like Dorothea. She would bring in lost individuals to her boarding home, those without a place to go, those without family or friends, people who needed help, people who would get money from the government each month. Much of her time was spent convincing these individuals to sign their rights over to her so she could cash their checks. In some of these later cases, she would assume their identities after she murders them for their social security checks after death. Serial killers in this country have been studied extensively. Much of the statistics have remained very similar over the past 50 years regarding serial killers, but each year things feel as though they continue to change. Perhaps there are necessary questions we aren't asking in order to find out further information about what may cause serial killers to actually kill. Each person has their own way of expressing their distaste in the world, but much of the tortured souls in childhood who didn't learn how to properly express themselves seem to grow up with a skewed worldview. This article by DailyMail and this documentary are extremely important historical evidence of where we were and where we are now with understanding serial killers. The ways in which we handle suspects has fundamentally changed since then, understanding that the face of a mental illness can hide behind any face, and if not carefully examined or questioned, you might just let a murderous grandma walk free. Misplaced resentment and remorse were the feelings trapped behind Dorothea's eyes. With enough statistics, perhaps one day we will be able to predict certain murderous intent behind future serial killers' eyes. Hey everyone, I got this idea from a DailyMail article recalling the life of Dorothea, and from that point it led me on a 3-hour rabbit hole of research, including the awesome documentary made by the Oxygen channel. If you want to learn more, be sure to follow the links below. If you want more content like this, check out my channel. Happy researching and thanks for watching.